Hey, this is Kurt Opsahl, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 290 for September 19th, 2022. Now, this was pre-recorded, so if there's any major cybersecurity or privacy news items that I'm failing to mention here, the reason is I'm on vacation. Now, I'll be coming back probably by the time you hear this, and this is one of the reasons why I did 2 interview shows back-to-back, because I knew I wasn't going to have time to do a full news show before I left. But today we have another interview, and this is with Kurt Opsahl from EFF. He's a really cool guy that I actually met in person at DEF CON and didn't realize until we did the interview that that was who I had met. So that was kind of interesting. But I reached out to him because the EFF had recently published an article about this group/software product called Tornado Cash. And Tornado Cash is a cryptocurrency mixer. And we're going to find out what all that means today. And the reason I wanted to talk about it, first of all, it's because it was in the news and it was kind of interesting. And cryptocurrency is always a fascinating subject, but there are free speech issues around what happened with Tornado Cash. And it's around software code as speech, and something that I don't think we often think about. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do that, and also to learn what a cryptocurrency mixer is and why cryptocurrency isn't always as private as it should be, and how things like mixers can improve your privacy and anonymity when it comes to dealing in cryptocurrency. And then also just to learn some more about our rights here in the United States for free speech and how they function and how they don't. Free speech isn't completely 100% free. There are things you can do that are not covered under the First Amendment. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, the history behind that, what is and is not covered, and what is going on here with this particular situation with this cryptocurrency mixing software. So I'm not going to lie, this is legal stuff. We are going to get, in some cases, kind of deep into some of the legal aspects of this. But I think it's good for all of us to understand how this stuff works. And along the way, we'll talk about a couple of interesting stories that have to do with free speech and code and copyright and things of that nature. All right, so let's get right to our interview with Kurt Opsahl from EFF. Kurt Opsahl is the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the leading nonprofit defending digital privacy, free speech, and innovation. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Kurt.
Pleasure to be here.
So you recently wrote an article on behalf of EFF about a topic that has a lot of really kind of esoteric and interesting angles, not only from a technology standpoint, but in this case, a legal standpoint. And I've been kind of wanting to dig into this, and I saw the article and I thought this would be a great person to talk to. So I'm glad you came on the show. But we're going to have to build up a couple of basics, a little bit of foundation here before we can get into the meat of this. So if you would, at a high level, just kind of explain, first of all, the audience knows what cryptocurrency is, but the anonymity aspect, the privacy aspect of cryptocurrency transactions, I think is widely misunderstood. A lot of people just assume it's a completely anonymous way to give somebody money or send money or to somebody, but that's not really true. So just at a high level, explain how transaction privacy varies, maybe depending on the type, because there's multiple types of cryptocurrency, and then how you shift that around, how you spend it or exchange it, that can affect your privacy and your anonymity.
Sure. I think this is it is a very common misconception on cryptocurrencies, in particular, Bitcoin and Ethereum, the two most popular cryptocurrencies. And later we're going to be talking more specifically about Ethereum. But what it allows is for people to have a wallet, and the wallet will have a number. It's a very long string that specifically identifies a wallet, and then you can transfer coins from one wallet to another wallet. Now, with the ordinary course of things, where it's very, as a layperson, you could see this string, this wallet, and not know who it is. So this may give people sort of an impression that this is at least pseudonymous. But as a starting point, all the transactions are listed in a blockchain, a ledger that is designed to be a immutable database, an immutable set of data that lists all the transactions, which wallets transferred assets to which other wallets. And so the key thing that could potentially break the potential privacy that you have is if your wallet gets associated with you as a person. And for many people, they use like Coinbase or some other, exchange, like the exchange knows who they are. If you purchase something with that wallet and, had something shipped to your address, right now, that wallet is associated with your name. And once a wallet is associated with your name, then someone can go back through all of the transactions that you've ever done and sort of get your complete history based on that wallet information, which makes it actually a pretty public form of transaction, unless you take some special steps to try to make it more protective.
Right. And the Coinbase thing is a big one because a lot of these companies are what we call KYC or know your customer organizations, where they go through the process of making sure they know exactly who you are. In fact, I think even from, I don't know if this is driven by financial regulations or if it's just mimicking bank financial regulations that often do this, but because they want to know if you're shifting money around because you might be doing it for illicit purposes, they want to be able to track you in this way. And I think it's actually odd how Coinbase and some of these other companies go out of their way to know your customer for a type of transaction that most people believe is private.
I think that, the KYC or know your customer rules, those are coming from financial regulations designed to create some records that can be used for later investigations or to enforce sanctions or money laundering, anti-AML, sometimes it's called anti-money laundering efforts. And so the largest exchanges will engage in this KYC, AML record keeping. And so often if you sign up, they ask for a picture of your driver's license, they, send in some documentation and such that is, pretty good at identifying who the person is. And then later, someone could try and get those records to find out who was associated with that account. And then there might be some wallets that are associated with that account. So tying those things together. You can also do a wallet-to-wallet transfer, right? You don't have to use an exchange, but certainly by and large, most people are doing their cryptocurrency transactions facilitated by an exchange.
All right, so that brings us to the next layer of the foundation that we're building here, and that is this notion of a cryptocurrency mixer. Given everything we just discussed, what is a cryptocurrency mixer, and why would I use such a thing?
So at sort of the highest level, and I should say I'm a lawyer, not a technologist, so bear with me on these explanations. And I'll also actually refer an organization known as Coin Center wrote up a explainer on how Tornado Cash work that goes into glorious detail that can really, drill down on this. But it's sort of at a high level, what a mixer does is it has a pool, and you put some coins into that pool, and you get the right to take the same amount of coins out of the pool. But it wouldn't necessarily be that your wallet that puts it in is connected to the wallet that takes it out. For example, let's say there's 20 wallets in this pool. You might put the coins into wallet number 1 and take them out of wallet number 20. And thus not having that, breaking that chain of transactions. And the idea, at least behind these, is to add back this anonymity, pseudonymity feature that people had hoped would be in Bitcoin and Ethereum, but wasn't actually there. And, in the original paper that Satoshi wrote about Bitcoin, he said this was going to be a property of it that gave you some pseudonymity. But that didn't really work out. And I think one of the things that, makes it so that there's so much privacy issues surrounding using these things is the ability of computers to trace through transactions and follow wallet transfer to wallet transfer and so on. It's just gotten easier to mine through that data at a level that maybe was not anticipated originally. And also as the value of these cryptocurrencies skyrocketed, and it's gone down a little bit recently, but still way, way higher than it was in the beginning. That creates an interest to put in the effort to do this. So these mixers, we're trying to add back in that privacy, or maybe even add it in the first place for real, that would make it difficult to do this chaining, so that, you still might know some information about, like, this wallet got X number of coins, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to take that and trace back the entire history of someone's transactions, or sort of, see where it's coming from. So, this is a very useful thing for adding some privacy and the potential for having your life exposed in this way. But, also, the concerns raised is that, people might use this for nefarious purposes, to hide a transaction. And I think, the intent behind it was to, provide strong privacy. But, with many technologies, this also could be used for, hiding something in a more negative way.
We've certainly seen many cases where privacy has caused a lot of grief for law enforcement, and they've talked about going dark for several years now. There were the crypto wars back in the 90s, and this has been a constant tension between privacy and law enforcement wanting to be able to go wherever they feel they need to go to trace something down, which will be a theme, I'm sure, throughout this entire conversation.
Absolutely. And I would say that, like, I think that the law enforcement is currently in a golden age of surveillance. The amount of capacity that they have to surveil and get record keeping about transactions is higher than it has ever been. But of course, they still complain about not having it all. And
right.
That, while you mentioned the crypto wars, I would say they're still ongoing. That is to say that we do have strong encryption, like that is the positive side. But it's not for lack of trying of the various governments to ask for backdoors, or, they don't call it backdoors anymore. They realize that bad term. But they'll say, we just want plain text access. You can have all the encryption you want so long as we can get the plain text.
Right.
And, this is a tension. And also, to put some of these things in perspective, like, consider cash. Cash can go around, and you can spend it and such without, if it's less than $10,000, you don't have to fill out paperwork around it. And then if you take it to the bank, it's over $10,000, then, you do. But there is this margin where you can have a lot of ordinary transactions that will not have the same kind of permanent record, and that is, a nice thing for society. But be that as it may, I think you're right that there is that tension, and people, we don't want to have money laundering, we don't want to have ransomware be able to be successful and get their money out. Like, there are good reasons for it. So how do we try and get these privacy properties and not give up our civil liberties while having effective tools? That is like a societal tension.
Yeah, and I think the funny thing, you brought up cash, and I think it's so funny because people talk about cash being the ultimate, untraceable source. But the funny thing is they're also pseudonymous. Every bill has a serial number, which is why in the classic, the old crime shows, the cops like, I want a $2 million in unmarked bills, or unsequential serial numbers on the bills and things like that, because those serial numbers. Funny enough, cash actually has serial numbers on it too, which is.
Absolutely. And, the non-sequential, right, that is a reference to, at least at some point, it was somewhat hard to check all the serial numbers. And so it was easier if you gave someone a sequence. You say, oh, this whole sequence is bad. And certainly, if you steal money from a bank, for example, they may have some knowledge of what those things, and look for them later. But, if you take cash with its serial number, and you hand it to a friend, and then they, tip a server, and then that server give it to their friend, like, each of those steps along the way, there's no reporting back what happened with that serial number. So when it eventually, goes to a business that deposited in their bank, and then they, look at a serial number again, you can know the beginning and end of that chain, but not all the steps along the way, right? And in some sense, like, that is what a mixer does.
I was going to just say, yeah, it's like a cash mixer.
Yeah.
Okay, so in December 2016, the White House, under Barack Obama at the time, instituted Executive Order 13964. What was the purpose of this order, and how has it been used prior to the case that we're about to discuss?
Well, so this is an executive order that Obama issued to address blocking the property of certain persons engaged in significant malicious cyber-enabled activities, is its formal name. And it was using some of the authority that the president had through some statutes, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, and this is a executive order that's trying to sort of effectuate that, and it gives a methodology to cause economic sanctions. It's been around for a while. It's been used for a variety of purposes. I must also say that I'm a civil liberties lawyer, so I'm not actually a sanctions expert. There are people who are very good at this. We have looked at sanctions in sort of limited contexts, like sanctions or export controls in particular that are around like cryptography. That's a longstanding part of EFF's history, so some knowledge of it, but it's been used for lots of different purposes.
A couple more things before we get to the meat of this, and that is, until this news item hit, I'd never heard of the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Controls, or OFAC, I guess is how you pronounce the acronym. OFAC. And I think I'd heard something about this specially designated nationals, or SDN list. Of course, the U.S. has several terrorist type lists, so maybe that's just another one. But so before we go to the meat of this, what is this office? What do they do? And what does it mean to be put on this SDN list?
Well, so OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, is the enforcement agency and within the Treasury Department. So it administers and enforces the various economic, trade sanctions that come through law, such as this executive order. And a violation of these sanctions has significant penalties. So, this is the agency that addresses that, and it's been around for 50, 60, probably 70 years. Long before the Obama executive order we were just discussing, but it is one of the agencies that administers that. And one of the methods by which they administer that is the Special Designated Nationals list, which is a list of sanctioned entities, often people that, are subject to sanctions. So coming out of the Russian war against Ukraine, a number of Russians were placed on this list, and that meaning that you're not supposed to do any business with sanctioned individuals.
All right. Okay. So now that we've laid all this groundwork, tell us what happened with this company or entity called Tornado Cash. Who is this organization? What do they do? And how did they draw the attention of the U.S. government?
Well, so I think there's something embedded in your question, which is, what is Tornado Cash? And, this is actually, we can get into this a little bit more later, but that's one of the, potentially confusing things about this order, because the term Tornado Cash could mean a lot of different things. At some level, it is an open source project that created the Tornado Cash software, this virtual currency mixer. It is, there's also subnames, like there's Tornado Cash Classic and Tornado Cash Nova, which are two variations of that software. And it could also mean, is it the group of people who were involved in publishing it? Is it the, there's a tornado.cash website, which was listed in the SDN by name. And so you say, what is this organization was there? So, it could be considered the name of an entity consisting of some, subset of these people. But the OFAC has not been particularly clear about what it is referencing when it says Tornado Cash. And one of the things that really, drew EFF's attention to this is that, one definition, at least, of Tornado Cash is the software itself. And, this, at least in a traditional way, you would put specially designated nationals. This list would be of entities, of organizations or people. It's not strictly entities. You will find names of ships that are on this list, but on the whole, it's going after organization. And I think one example is that prior to this, there was a Blender.io, which also was a mixer. But as I understand it, it was a mixer that operated itself. There actually was a identifiable entity involved. And so when they're saying Blender.io, it could more clear that they were referring to that entity. And we haven't gotten to this level of detail, but they were known as a custodial mixer. So they took possession of the funds and then did some things and then paid out the money, while what the Tornado Cash software is what's called a smart contract. And a smart contract exists on the, in this case, Ethereum blockchain. as basically a piece of code that, it gets inputs, it gives outputs, and does its thing, but it doesn't require a person to operate it. It just operates on its own. And so you have there's like the GitHub page. We can get further into that in a little bit, but the GitHub page that had all the source code of how it worked, but that wasn't like the operational thing. Like that source code was informative about how it worked, but the operational thing, the one that actually moved coins around, was a version of that code that exists on the blockchain.
What drew the U.S. government to this? How did they run afoul of this executive order or the government or some other law? What drew their attention? What was it they were doing, and specifically that caused them to be sanctioned?
Well, I mean, according to the government, no reason to think they were incorrect. They claimed that the Tornado Cash mixer was used to launder some Ethereum coin. Millions of dollars worth of coins, and they identified the Lazarus Group, which is a state-sponsored hacking group affiliated with the North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And then they also were saying that several ransomware outfits were using this to launder the funds. So ransomware operates by encrypting people's computers and saying, we will decrypt it if you pay us enough money, and they get paid in coins. But as we were saying, like, you can follow these transactions, and so for ransomware to operate profitably, it needs to break the connection between the ransom payment and the actual people who are going to benefit from it. So these were the allegations of the Treasury Department. As we were looking into this, we looked at an analysis by an organization known as Chain Analysis. And they were looking not just at Tornado Cash, but at mixers generally. And according to their study, illicit addresses, wallet addresses, accounted for about 23% of the funds sent to mixers. It's certainly not the majority, but as a fairly substantial number.
Yeah.
And that's what drew the ire of the Treasury Department.
Obviously, we're not arguing that money laundering should be legal or that there's a problem there. The issue that you in particular brought up in your article was free speech. So how does that apply here?
Well, what we did a lot of focus on is this argument that well established at this point, that code is a form of speech, that by writing code, you are doing an expressive activity. And what that means is that the First Amendment applies to that code, and that there is a regulation or a law that is restricting the ability to speak, then that has to go through the First Amendment analysis. It's important to note that that analysis is not is not the end of the story, where under some analysis, a regulation may be upheld and others could be held unconstitutional. And in particular, we were concerned about a potential interpretation of this somewhat ambiguous order to mean that you could not host the source code, that GitHub could not host the source code. So we are representing Professor Matthew Green, a well-known cryptographer who works in this space, who studies cryptocurrencies. And what he did was put up a copy of the code on a GitHub page. And we believe that under the First Amendment, that both he has a right to publish this, and GitHub has a right to host it, despite these sanctions. Now, hopefully, OFAC is not actually interpreting this to mean that one can't publish the code, and it's been up there for, I guess, close to a month now. I forget exactly what day that it went up, maybe a little less, but it remains up. So we have at least established that that is happening, and so far, the hammer hasn't come down. And I think that's important, because it's also a signal to other people that, where we're sort of putting it out there prominently, and to show to people that not only do we believe that this is the case, but here it is happening, and a canary in the GitHub.
So the reason he had to repost it because it was the original posting taken down from a different GitHub repository?
That's right. That's right. So the canonical repository for the Tornado Cache code, including its new variant Tornado Cache Nova, was removed shortly after the listing on the SDN list. And this something that GitHub took down the Tornado Cache GitHub account.
Okay, so GitHub did this of their own volition. They were contacted back to OFAC and asked to remove it?
So I think that is a great question to ask GitHub. What we know is that the order came out and then it was removed. The accounts of 3 of the more prominent contributors to that were taken down. But not everybody who contributed to it. And I think that's another important point on the free speech aspect of it. Remember, this is open source software, right? So a lot of people will contribute. They might see a flaw and make a request, a pull request, as it's called, for a modification to the code, or contribute some small piece, some large piece, and any given open source project. There are many people who are involved in it. And only a few had their accounts taken down. But note also that the list, the specially designated national list, it just listed Tornado Cache. It did not identify any individuals as being subject to these sanctions, which is again part of that unclarity.
All right. So since you mentioned the people, let's take a slight diversion. One of the developers of this software was recently arrested in the Netherlands. I realize this is outside the U.S. and not covered by your article, but this seems to kind of set a bad precedent. I mean, does the EFF have a position on this, or generally speaking, whether a programmer of any sort has legal liability for software they wrote that may have been used to commit a crime?
So I think you're raising a good question. One of the things, of course, we saw the news of this arrest, and it was obviously related to this general area. At least it came from a financial regulatory entity, an enforcement entity in the Netherlands. But I have yet to see any official explanation of what the legal theory behind what caused this arrest. So, of course, what would be very concerning would be that if the theory was you wrote this code, it was later used by North Korea and in ransomware for illegal activities, and therefore you're criminally responsible for what someone else has done. And they also have allegations that there was a greater involvement than just writing the code. I don't know what those are, or whether if there were such allegations, there'd be a question: are they true? But the most concerning thing for development of innovation, for being able to express yourself through code, is you don't want to have a scenario that by writing some code that is later misused, you could be held criminally liable for that later misuse. Open source projects require people to volunteer their time, right? And if you're going to volunteer your time on something, you're trying to preserve privacy, you're trying to make this thing. Certainly, you don't want money laundering, ransomware to succeed here, but you do want to have people to have private transactions. Then, if somebody's like, but if somebody does use it for these things, then you're gonna get arrested. That really disincentivizes people from contributing to the code and being part of that process. And if taken to an extreme, and hopefully it never will be, but if taken to an extreme, there is a ton of code that could be used, for bad purposes later. That there's all sorts of ways to transfer files, and that can be used for transferring illicit files, not just about money. And you have the dark web, and if your software is being used to host a dark web site, are you responsible for the dark activities that occur there? That would be very troubling.
Yeah, this starts to have a flavor of kind of like the Section 230 stuff, where if you've got a platform and that platform is open to most, you're a private company, we'll get to this later, where you could choose who's on your platform. But if you are hosting something like that and one of the people using your platform posts something illegal, what are your liabilities And generally, at least so far, thanks to Section 230, we don't hold the platform responsible as long as once they're made aware of it, they take the proper actions. Did I get that kind of right?
I mean, I think generally what 230 says is you don't hold the soapbox liable for what the speaker has said. Section 230 was enacted to address an issue in the law where there was a notion that if you were engaged in moderation, if you make choices, editorial decisions about what stayed up and what stayed down, then you became liable for what was said. And if you did no choices, if you just let everything up, if you were like, the phone company that, whatever you say on the phone, you're not liable as a phone company for that. And this was conceived as being a problem, as it was a disincentive to do moderation. And what they wanted to do was pave a path that allowed for content moderation so that things which were lawful, but nevertheless would be, indecent. That was their concern at the time, but also just, offensive, that this would enable content moderation. And so if you engage in content moderation, what I'm saying is you're not becoming responsible for what. So it allows you to remove those things without taking the responsibility, but it doesn't require. And sort of by contrast, passed right around the same time in the 90s, there's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which does have a conditional immunity so that to retain the legal liability protection for copyrighted works, you do have to take action, such as taking it down, and then you can put it back up if someone's a counter notice and there's a whole process around it.
All right, so now here's where we get to split the fine hairs. And like free speech, like any right, it does have limitations. It's not unlimited. The classic example for free speech is, they say you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. It's also said that, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And yet software can be harmful. I mean, not just to data or computers, but to humans. And Bruce Schneier wrote a whole book about this called Click Here to Kill Everybody. Malware can bring down the power grid or cause a car to crash or stop a pacemaker from working. So how do you define the shouting fire in a crowded theater line for software? Like, qualitatively speaking, what sort of code speech should not or would not be protected by the First Amendment?
So I think this is absolutely a common phrase used here, the shouting fire in a crowded theater. And I push back against that phrase for a couple of reasons. One is we should take a look at its origins. Its origins came from Schenck versus United States, a World War I era case that was deciding whether it was okay, and it said that it wasn't okay, to have a pamphlet that was protesting the draft for World War II. And for, I think, most people's conception of what is allowed or not allowed under the First Amendment, you wouldn't imagine that it would be okay to have a law that said you can't protest the draft. And, we dealt with that since then. And then this was sort of an example that was being used at the time. Since then, in the 60s, there's a more modern version of this, or partially overturning Schenck, to say that instead of the Schenck standard, which is whether there was a clear and present danger, the standard was whether the speech was designed to incite imminent lawless action. And this is the notion that, like, if you say, at some vague point in the future, you should go commit a crime, like that is not enough to make it unlawful under them. It has to be something where right here, right now, go burn down that building over there. And that, so it has to be imminent. You have to be, it has to be, in fact, likely to cause that. So, sometimes you could say, like, it's about a riot. Like if you are inciting people to do a riot or do specific crimes. And this is because there's a lot of like rhetorical speech that is, this thing is so terrible, we should burn this whole place down, and that is protected speech. It is not designed to give imminent lawless action. And this is also, people have written books describing, how you can do criminal activities, sometimes in the context of fiction, sometimes, purportedly nonfiction. There's like the Anarchist Cookbook that was very famous for a while. It's providing some instructions on how to, make homemade bombs. And so the standard for something which is not protected by the First Amendment, because it is inspiring imminent law, it is actually quite high. And this would include that if there is a code that could be used for lawless action, are you participating in that? Are you like giving it to someone and then for their imminent use of it for lawless action? Another code context, it has come up in the where someone has crossed the line, where created a tool and for a security tool, which could be used for penetration testing, could be used by security researchers, or you could also use it to break into something. And then if somebody wrote to you as the author of that code and say, hey, I'm trying to break into this bank to empty out the accounts, but like I came up with this bug, can you help me fix it? And you're like, great, here's how to fix that bug. You've crossed the line there, because you know that they're going to be using it for illegal purposes. You're participating. You might be called conspiring with them or whatnot. But if on the other hand, you create a pen testing tool and put it out there and say, security researchers use this to test it, but then somebody does use it for illegal activity, right? That shouldn't be held responsible for creating this tool.
Obviously, in a lot of these cases, too, it's how you use the code that was probably the crime as opposed to the code itself, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. And another thing that we're trying to get at with our discussion in the blog post, and I think it's good for your listeners to understand, is that if something is protected by the First Amendment, what that means is that the government, if they want to have a regulation, they have to pass a judicial scrutiny. The court will look at the regulation and see if it is acceptable or unacceptable. And there is, at a high level for content speech, they have to pass strict scrutiny. For more content neutral speech, if they're trying to regulate content neutral, then there's what's called intermediate scrutiny. So it's not the end of the story. And so to flip back to a second with the sort of the problem or with the shouting fire in a crowded theater metaphor, is that at best it stands for the relatively unremarkable proposition that some speech might not pass that muster. But not that any particular speech that you're talking about does or does not. And you have to dive into this. Is it content based? Is it content neutral? So the typical example of sort of a content neutral, you might have heard this phrase, time, place, and manner. You can go to the park and have your speech, but at 10 o'clock, the park is closed, and that if there's a regulation that you want to do a protest after 10 o'clock, that the court may say, well, this is content neutral. It doesn't matter whether you are protesting in favor of one thing or opposed to another thing. They're not looking at the content of what people are saying. They're just saying 10 o'clock. No one can speak here because the park is closed. It's quiet hours, and we're trying to make it so the residents nearby are not disturbed. So that would be like an example of a content neutral regulation. And then a content regulation would be I think that was based on what you said. So if it said that you could go to the park and have a rally in favor of the current government, but if you were opposed to that government, then we won't issue you a permit, right? That would be obviously unconstitutional, right? Because it's based on the content. But of course, the ones that come up to cases are usually more complex than that, and whether it is regulating content. So we go through in the post here is to look at some of these things, and that one is just establishing that code is a form of it, and then I think that the best way of looking at it is a regulation that prohibits writing code that has a particular function or a purpose is content based. So, for example, one of the things that has been around for a long time since the crypto wars started in the 90s is that, it's trying to regulate things whose function or purpose was to encrypt communications, something that the government wanted to have less of, or at least wanted to have it be available to the government, but maybe not to the citizens. And so a regulation that says, well, you can publish various pieces of code, but if they have the function and purpose of providing encrypted communications, you can't, or you can't export it. That's what we usually came up in. then this is a content-based regulation. And so it gets that highest level of scrutiny, the strict scrutiny. And that means it has to be narrowly tailored. The law must be written so narrowly, using the least restrictive means to achieve their legitimate purpose. And you can't put more restrictions than necessary to advance that compelling interest. And so this comes into questions like, does it, are these real harms? And will this regulation actually, the representation of Matt Green, we're looking at, putting the code up there, the source code on GitHub, where people can examine the code, they can download the code, they can propose modifications, they can create their own fork, they could do a bunch of things. But prohibiting that would not advance a anti-money laundering purpose. It's not the least restrictive means of doing that. It's not narrowly tailored to something that would achieve their anti-money laundering objective, but it would actually, prohibit both the discussion of it, Professor Green from teaching it in his class, and having the code out there for study, and then maybe someone trying to enhance the code to make it so that it provides privacy but is not useful for money laundering. Like, that would be an advancement that would even help achieve some of the government's objectives.
All right, so that's a perfect segue into talking about GitHub, and which is a private organization to determine what it will and won't host on its website. And I think this is another common misconception with the law. For example, people claiming that their First Amendment rights are violated when they're quote unquote deplatformed. So, Twitter bans somebody and they scream about their First Amendment rights are being violated. They're being censored. So first of all, can you explain why the First Amendment doesn't really apply in this case? And second, given this perspective, why are you guys raising the free speech issue in relation to the Tornado Cache and GitHub?
So that's a very good question, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions. And just to put it out there, what does the First Amendment do? It protects you against censorship by the government. It is to protect the prospect that the government would decide what speech is acceptable, what is not, enforce that. The regulations are criminally, and this was something that is, the freedom of expression is recognized as a human right throughout the world. It's in the international human rights principles, and in the United States, it is enshrined in our Bill of Rights as the First Amendment as a protection against the government. But a private entity like GitHub has its own First Amendment rights. It has its rights, and those. It is not just the right to publish something, but to choose what to publish. So, a website has the First Amendment right to not publish something. There actually is a whole body of case law for this opposite proposition about compelled speech, that just as the government can't say based on the content, like what you aren't allowed to say, they cannot require you to say things. And this has come up in a variety of contexts. Right now, there's some laws that have passed prominently in Texas and Florida that have tried to regulate social media so that they can't shadow ban or deplatform or what, and those are constitutionally challenging. Well, we have argued that they're unconstitutional, and I believe they are, because they are compelled speech, saying these sites have to host the private sites have to host a private party's conversation. One of the more amusing cases along compelled speech line was a case involving New Hampshire, the free state, who has the motto "Live free or die." And they put it on their license plate. And there was a case about when they could compel a citizen of the free state to say, "Live free or die." Of course, the answer was no. You can't. And not just on irony, but because of these First Amendment principles. So bringing that back to the GitHub, GitHub has the right to do content moderation on their site. They don't want to host some things, or they do want to host other things. But what we were saying is, when we're bringing up the First Amendment rights, is that we think that Matt Green has the right against the government to host it, and that GitHub also has a right against the government. Its First Amendment right is to host it. Now, it may choose not to. I'd like for them to choose to do so. But the reason why we're bringing up the First Amendment in this context is because the takedowns occurred right after some government action, right? So there is at least a implicit danger of government action. As we were pointing out, this is a very vague order. It's unclear whether that's actually what was the government intended, but it creates a chilling effect. A chilling effect of whether you could host this code. So we wanted to signal that it is something that we believe, based on the analysis, that GitHub has the right to do. Of course, they still have to choose to do so.
As we're winding down here, there's one more aspect of this that, whenever you start talking about some of these legal aspects, I think probably a layman would think they're all arcane, but what I find really interesting legal aspect about this is that the code itself, and maybe I misunderstood this, but for the way I read this from your article, maybe somewhere else, is that the code itself is kind of embedded in the blockchain record. Like it's kind of already published in such a way that the way blockchain works is everyone basically has a copy of this ledger, this digital ledger. So it's effectively everywhere. It would be impossible at this point to remove from existence. And that made me think, as I was reading that, about two other cases from history that I thought were just classic cases of this. And one was, there was a guy who figured out back in the day how to decrypt supposedly encrypted or, DRM'd, digital rights management, and affected DVDs, making them copy proof. And the copy protection, I think, was called CSS. So he created this thing called DCSS. And there were issues around him publishing this. And I think and he basically published the code on a t-shirt and somehow worked around the copyright issue that way, kind of in the same way that Phil Zimmerman, the guy who created PGP back in the day, published the code for PGP, which the government was trying to squelch, as a book. So are these legal loopholes? Are these sort of tactics legitimate? What is your take on some of these things? I'm curious as a lawyer, how you feel about this kind of working around some of these laws to get things published.
I mean, I believe that code is protected in the form of code, but I think what some of these people have tried to do, and there's a T-shirt, there was like a haiku that had.
That's right.
That actually for Tornado Cash, somebody made a YouTube video where they were singing the code and coming along, and I think what these are really just ways of like illustrating sort of the speech aspects of it is that the same information, can be done in more traditional, obviously acknowledged aspects of speech. Because while I think the courts have established this since the 90s that code is a form of speech and it's protected by the First Amendment, it's much more obvious to people that a song would be, or a poem, or a T-shirt, that they're taking the code and re-expressing it in a form that is more obvious to a layperson is something that would be speech protected. And in some sense, it is saying like, well, if you're going to go after it in the form of code, you also have to go after my poem, my music, my T-shirt, my interpretive dance that is expressing this. So that sort of crystallizes the issues. But from a legal point of view, the thing that we've established is that code in and of itself is expressive, and this mostly comes in the form of in a lot of cases we're talking about source code, but source code becomes compiled code, but compiled code is a version of that source code, and it has this functionality, and so it is still protected as compiled code. It's just that you're now looking at the functionality when doing that scrutiny analysis we were just talking about.
So what's next here for Tornado Cash and their source code? Will EFF be doing anything further at this point if nothing else happens? And maybe this issue in general, where do you see this kind of going from here?
Well, so one thing that we have done is we've also reached out to the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, to try and start a conversation with them to get some more clarity about what they are meaning by that. That so far has not borne fruit. We have heard back from them. We haven't had a substantive conversation yet. So we'll see if that is helpful, because I think they could do a lot to help reassure some people that it's not as broad as it could be, and narrow this down and trying to make it have less unintended consequences or collateral damage here. So that would be ongoing, and hopefully they would issue something to clarify. In addition, I just was seeing, this came out yesterday, you may have seen this, but there was a group of people who have filed a lawsuit to assert their rights. Yep. They raise a number of issues. I've just had a brief chance to look over what's going on there, and so I need to look at it much more deeply to get a good view. But it is my understanding that they are raising, amongst other things, that they want to have the right to work on the code and modify it. So they are raising these issues that we care deeply about. And there's a lot of other issues that are involved here, certainly like, one of the ones we were talking about earlier, financial privacy, how this fits in with money laundering regulations. And there's a number of great organizations who are really in depth about that, who are hitting on the issues, where EFF's strength is in working for decades on these code is speech First Amendment issues. So that's probably where our focus will be moving forward. And so we'll take a look at that case. There may be other cases that come about to challenge this. And then, as I was saying, trying to get some more clarity and remove some of the ambiguity that was created by the vaguely worded or ambiguously worded designation on the list. One of the concerns that we have as well is that ambiguity may not be a mistake. It may be that we're trying to have it be sort of ambiguous to give them more room later to do things, and using they might say, well, we'll use our discretion to only go after people who are really doing bad things, but we don't want to cut off that option, which I can understand, but this creates those sort of chilling effects. That something may be lawful, may be constitutionally protected, may not, cause any bad things, might be chilled, and to drill down on it. But if you're in a situation where there are years in prison, huge fines, that there could be the penalties involved, but you might say, well, there's a really good chance that I would win if this came to a court case. 95% of the time, estimate I would win, but a 1 in 20 chance of going to jail would still chill somebody, right? It doesn't have to be a weak case or something to have a chill. People can be chilled even if they have a really good legal argument. So that's why I think it's very important to get that clarity and at least find out if they are trying to do it ambiguously or not. And one of the things I also just wanted to touch on this is sort of mentioning that there were two versions of the Tornado Cash Brothers. The Nova was the new one, and it was introduced in December of last year, and is in a beta. And as part of that beta, there's a limitation of using one Ethereum coin maximum. One Ethereum coin is worth several $1,000s. I haven't, it moves a lot, so I'm not sure exactly what it is. But it is, with that kind of limitation, it is a very poor tool to do the millions of dollars scale money laundering that people are trying to do. And, that is still listed in the SDN. And, you might at least sort of is that something that is really going to be a tool for these bad acts? And maybe to expand on that a little bit, one thing to note is that doing the mixer is not you can do it wrong. You can use a mixer and fail to keep yourself anonymous. For example, especially given the sort of relatively high values of some of these coins, the amount of coin that equals your X dollars is a coin plus a decimal point and plus a lot of numbers after the decimal point. It's pretty specific. And so if you put in 50.782348861 coins into it, and then somebody takes out exactly that number and all those decimal points later, it's not too hard to put the pieces together. And if you have to do a lot of sort of small transactions and such that are doing this, it can also make it difficult to not screw it up along the way, which would mean that with this limitation, for a lot of the transactions that one might care about for other purposes, for having a private transaction, would be lower than that amount, but it still wouldn't be super useful for money laundering. taking a moment, like, so why do we care about the sort of the financial privacy? Well, one reason is that, not just for the privacy itself, but like you might be buying something that is part of your expressive activities that'll be revealing about your, donated to a political organization or a political campaign, or you're purchasing a book or a subscription to a magazine that says something about what you're trying to read. That is also part of your like First Amendment right to do anonymously. And a lot of those kinds of transactions are going to be relatively small dollar transactions. So, I am at least curious as to what their problem was with the Nova software, at least as it was limited at the time they put the sanctions.
Well, thank you so much for being out there and parsing these fine things for us and fighting for our rights. I'm a monthly contributor to you guys. You guys have been around. I think you just celebrated your 30th anniversary. So I'd encourage people to go to EFF.org, look around, sign up for newsletters, send them some money if you can. You guys are doing some wonderful work. And Kurt, thank you so much for coming on the show and explaining this very arcane notion of crypto mixing.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So there you have it. I did warn you we were going to get into the weeds a little bit with legal stuff, but I think it was all still interesting to know and understand how this stuff works in the context of this current story about Tornado Cash. And I also thought it was interesting just to kind of dig a little deeper into why cryptocurrency isn't as anonymous as a lot of people think it is, and that there are some interesting solutions that will help make it much more anonymous. But of course, bad guys can use that same tool to hide their tracks. All right, so next week we'll be back on schedule with a news show, and we'll be back on our alternating news/interviews going forward from here. Next week I'll be talking with Jordan Wines. He's a cybersecurity expert, and we're going to talk a little bit about how hackers hone their skills and why this is something that you might actually have a fun time dabbling with yourself. I've also got a great interview with Doug Levin coming up. He is an expert on cybersecurity and privacy for K through 12, that is kindergarten through 12th grade here in the United States. Not just the schools themselves, which is definitely an issue because there have been ransomware attacks on school systems as recently as a couple weeks ago, but also for the students themselves. With COVID in particular and at-home proctoring of tests, students' privacy rights have really been trampled. So that'll be a really interesting discussion. I don't think that aspect of security and privacy gets talked about enough. So I'm really looking forward to you hearing that interview with Doug coming up soon too. And I've got several other interviews in the pipeline. So lots of great stuff coming up, including the big 300th episode, just 10 weeks away. Stay tuned for some information about the mailbag feature. I'll be probably starting to ask for those next week, answering your questions here on the air, and even giving you the chance to send me an audio file so you can ask the question yourself. I'll be having a promotion coming up soon for the 300th episode. Stay tuned. Lots of great goodness coming up. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care out there. And as always, stay safe and don't get caught with your drawbridge down.